So we're delighted to be joined now by Ivan Jordan, who is an actual architect. We talk a lot on this show about building homes and building stuff in general. Ivan actually does it for a living. Ivan, you're down in Exeter, you're working to try and construct things, and we wanted to talk to you because you sent us such an interesting email about some of the challenges you face, particularly around heritage and listed buildings and building stuff when we want to protect other historical things. So I guess my first question is, could you give us a bit of a background on how heritage works when it comes to building? So I'm sure people are aware of like listed buildings and so on. So how do we decide what buildings get listed and what buildings we can tear down and build something new on top of?
So right now, listed buildings are put forward by Historic England, which is a classic Quango, quasi non-governmental organisation, I think, which still receives a lot of state funding. Last year, they, let's say in the year 24 to 25, I think, or maybe the year before, I think it was 1,002 listings were added to the national list. Their boast being that 99% of their recommendations to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So they put the recommendation through, and then that gets rubber stamped. And what they're saying is 99% of their recommendations. An interesting one off their website is that they have increased the listing on a church which features on a Chemical Brothers record. Anyone knows the Chemical Brothers? What they tend to do, these sorts of organizations, they like to show they're down with the kids all the time. So the one that they will cherry pick to talk about is the one that's on the cover of a record, because I guess they were all at university. They all loved Dance to the Chemical Brothers and what else. And oh, look, we're making this a lovely, friendly, jolly thing for the kids. But that's just my cynical viewpoint. But that's how they get listed now.
So essentially, if James was in charge of Historic England, all the sort of Scar locations would be sort. I don't know what features on Scar albums, James, but
I suppose it'd be like all of Coventry, wouldn't it? You know,
Yeah.
that would be like I know buildings there. We need to preserve it exactly as it was in the 1980s.
Yeah, or Handsworth, if you were a Steel Pulse fan as well. The Handsworth Revolution actually meant. Yeah. but you, well, you laugh, but actually you could make really strong social history arguments for listing some of those parts as being important in people's lives. And so do Historic England. They also list things on the basis of people or organizations who lived in a building or an area. And that seems to be a reason to protect that built environment. We can talk about that a bit more. I think a lot of that is questionable, but we can get into that. So but just to quickly sum up as well, I think the list first came about in about 1955. I think someone will jump out and correct me on that. But prior to that, it just didn't exist. And it gradually became kind of entrenched. It started off, I think, that local authorities were required to provide a list of locally significant buildings. Anyone who's done any architectural training will know the works of the guy called Pevsner. He drove around the country in a Morris Minor very famously and wrote these textbooks where each county has a list of important buildings, which was the Pevsner list. And I'm not sure if that came before or after listings started, but basically it's probably around that basis. And then that all became statutory, basically. So that's where it started, and it's grown and grown and grown, and we're up to now thousands of listed buildings. I think Devon alone, where I worked, last time I looked, had well over 3,000 listed buildings. It's probably twice that now, to be honest. But yeah, so it's been a slow growth into something which is now an institution.
a slow growth, but I guess it compounds somewhat over time. And it sounds a lot like sites of special scientific interest, where it's very easy to create them, and we get, hundreds created each year, but you can't really get rid of them again. And so the number just keeps going up and up and up and up over time. And obviously every year there's more history.
Absolutely. Every year there's more history. And of course, for the people who are in the organizations who are nominating these buildings, there's absolutely no incentive to take anything off the list ever, because they're just doing themselves out of a job. And that's not what bureaucracies do.
So how does this impact what you do for a living? So, someone comes to you and they say, I want you to build me a house, and you come up with a plan, but then you have to interact with the heritage system. How does that work for you from your perspective?
What I would tend to do is put together some proposals with a client which I think are sympathetic to the building, or are adding to the heritage value, or mindful of it at the very least, and then take it to a heritage officer, which is an appointed officer, used to be a conservation officer. You discuss it with them. They might say, well, it's all right, but can we change the color or size of this or whatever? And then on you go, you negotiate something. That's the way it's supposed to work. Now, the way it is working is sometimes we can get a pre-application discussion with the council before we submit a planning application. Very often that might just take months and months. We might just submit an application, and what might happen is the heritage officer might be consulted even we didn't want, no one was going to be involved, and then suddenly jump out of the woodwork 3 days before the application's due for determination. An email will drop in and someone will be saying, no, you can't do it. It's too big, it's too wrong, you need to change this design completely. So it can be very last minute. The quality of the reporting that you're getting back from this person who is a statutory consultee is very often very poor. I mean, grammatically poor. I mean, it'll just be sort of, a note at the end of an email. And that's really problematic because by that point, clients are fully invested in this project. And it might just be one house, or it might be 5 houses, it might be a small housing project or whatever. You can't have things like that just suddenly popping up out of the blue when there is actually a perfectly good, accountable system for these things to be managed. And they're not managed, but because of the funny position that the heritage officers are in, that they're effectively unaccountable, you won't ever get a planner who'll say, sorry, you're too late, that's ridiculous, I'm overriding this. They just won't do it. They will go with whatever a heritage officer says because they're not empowered to do anything else.
So is there a sense that there's any kind of consistency here? We talk a lot on this podcast about the difference between kind of good regulatory bodies and bad ones. And I think one of the signs of a good one is that there's a kind of predictability. If you're a business, you're trying to get something through, you have some understanding from previous cases and examples, and maybe there's something a bit unique about your case, but you enter into a dialogue and you have a sense that you're kind of working together to build up how this thing should work. In these examples, is it more the case that every officer is like their own unique kind of person with their own take, and you're effectively starting from scratch each time?
Yes. I mean, you can form long-standing relationships with the heritage officer over a few years, as I did. I have one in particular in mind who was pretty good, actually, but she went off and became a planning inspector. And there was another guy I worked with quite well, but the planning officers tend to come and go, and they're part of this planning sort of milieu as well. What I would say is, with reference to what you're talking about, a sort of organized way of doing this, is they're not actually run by Historic England. They're not employed by them. They're employed as individuals, but the whole thing is kind of sanctioned by this overarching Historic England heritage mindset that gives them this sort of power. And you really do have to think, well, how am I going to play this person? This is a different opponent to the last one. It shouldn't even be an opponent. It should be someone you can just have a discussion with. And that does mean that your politics with a small p is on show. And sometimes I get it wrong. Well, the other thing you can do is, right, I should quickly say, the other thing that we tend to do is the client will employ their own heritage consultant who will produce a report which will say, actually, these proposals are perfectly fine because the setting of the listed building is not unduly affected. And they have this whole language around that stuff called harm. So you can just have levels of harm. And if you have what you're looking for ideally with a heritage proposal is someone to say, no harm will be done. And the way you might achieve that is with your private consultant to come along and say this. But it is all very subjective. And sometimes I've seen very unprofessional exchanges between the two heritage consultants, one on the council side, one on the private side, where they're just insulting each other and they're doing nothing to actually get this development done. It's like something out of a schoolyard.
So how do you think this could work better if you were in charge of designing the system? So I think everyone listening would probably say we need to have some protections for old buildings, surely? I mean, I don't want to knock down Westminster Abbey. I'm very pro-housing, but I also think, it's probably quite nice that we keep Westminster Abbey around. So on the one hand, we need some sort of law to protect stuff like that. Well, on the other hand, maybe we can argue more about the churches on album covers. So how would you design the system to sort of square the two desires?
I think what we need to do is have a real sort of cultural reset where what we talk about is not the age of the building necessarily, we talk about its quality. What we have to remember is the reason the old buildings that we have now exist is because they were the better ones. The bad ones all got knocked down. The better ones got looked after. They are here. That all happened without any statutory oversight because people own these buildings. They live in them, they invest in them, they love them. In my view, there's actually very little requirement for a statutory oversight of any type, right? Except for the most valuable ones, the Westminster Abbeys. Or even you could say, if we're looking at building history, we could say there should be exemplars in, let's say, every town where we could look at, this is how the Georgians did it in this part of the world. But we do not need thousands of these. What we need to do, in my view, is bring that back down to maybe a few hundred, really focus resources on them, really saying, look, these are going to be preserved. These are museum pieces. Maybe the people who are living in those houses get state help to do that or something like this. And the rest of it, no, we just got to cut them off, let them go. I'm not saying demolish. Well, maybe in some cases do demolish. We just don't need what we what we have to. Again, I'll just return to that point. I'm trying to make a distinction between a building which is being preserved because it's old and a building which is being preserved because it's good. There is no distinction at the moment, and that's simply not helping us. There are a lot of buildings which are old and are listed and are actually very poor for living in there. They're not only are they cold and inefficient and all that stuff, but they might also be very, very bad for natural light or things like that. I mean, old buildings are not just by definition better than new ones. That's just not true.
So the other thing I wanted to ask you about is sightlines. So I'm sure a lot of people listening, because it's quite a famous thing, will know that the reason that lots of buildings in central London are shaped the way they are is because of St Paul's Cathedral. And there's rules around, like, you have to be able to see it from certain positions around the city. I think the most extreme one is you have to be able to see St Paul's Cathedral from Richmond Park, which is a long way out in southwest London. So what's your view on sightlines? Because this seems to me like quite an obvious compromise position where we can keep the lovely old building, but then allow us to build other new things around it more easily.
I mean, I think if you go to Rome, there are blanket rulings across Rome about I believe, I mean, I don't know this sightline law that you're talking about either. I've never heard of that. So I'm going to fact check that myself.
Maybe I'm talking rubbish.
Well, I'm not saying it's the sort of thing that gets cited, but actually there might not be anything formally written down about that. It's a bit like building lines. There's ideas that houses have a natural frontage line that is called the building line. You can't build in front of the building line. Well, it was not written down anywhere. It just gets pulled up in objections. So I'd be interested to see about the sightlines one. What I would say is if you look at places like Rome, they just say height, which is a similar thing. Like, you just can't put anything above 5 stories or something like that, and because we want to still see the Colosseum. Oh, okay, fair enough. But in my view, what this really comes onto is this idea about being in the setting of a listed building. Now, that's ostensibly, on the face of it, that's fair enough, isn't it? Look, you've got a beautiful listed building. It has a setting. You can't just put a Safeway supermarket right next to this 12th century church. Or can you? Or can you? We've never worried about it before. You go to somewhere really ancient, like Rome, for example, you will find piazza with 4 churches looking at each other from 2 or 3 meters, well, not quite that close, but, right up against each other in such ways that the facade, their front elevation, which is designed with this, let's say, a beautiful Baroque symmetrical thing, is completely ruined by this, 15th century addition just next to it. But that's part of the mix. This idea that we're now protecting things and everything around them is just like we've never done it before. Why is this going to actually make things better for us? Particularly when we talk about an abundance agenda, I think all that stuff has to go, to be honest.
I think that there's an interesting sort of subtext, I guess, behind that as well, which you talked earlier about houses effectively being kept as a kind of museum piece. And that's essentially what we've done is we've turned parts of the UK into almost a kind of museum.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of political or cultural mix behind that as well, because there's a sense that, well, someone at some point decided that a certain set of kind of values or ideas or a particular idea of England is what justifies inclusion in this, Museum of England. So you've talked a little bit about how you think buildings could be classified, according to quality. But is there kind of a political dimension or like a bias in terms of how these sorts of museum pieces have been selected in the past?
So I think that's probably true. I mean, the listing notes, the Historic England hold the listing notes. So if you hear about a listed building, you can go up there and you can see the notes that originally applied to it. And it would typically say something like, it's of merit because there was a pig shed around the back there and there's a nice bit of stone detailing here or there. It would just give you a quick detail as to why this building is listed. And sometimes next to nothing. And I think I'm tempted to go full Marxist on this and say, I'm not a Marxist, but that it's Downton Abbey. Really, that's what's going on, is that as a national identity, we're very much tied to our heritage, and people just can't see, for example, the Buckingham Palace, right, is actually a minger of a building. I mean, it's a mess, right?
It's a large square.
It's a
basically.
large square.
Let's be honest.
When you get past the facade, it's just a mess. Diana said it was awful to live in. It was cold and dark. But this is a national institution, so I'm not going to suggest we knock down Buckingham Palace. It's not going to happen, right? But are we protecting that because of the quality of the building? No, probably not. And to be fair to the listed system, they're saying, well, no, we might be listing because of all sorts of other significances that building might have. And I just think that's really questionable. I think right now we've got a huge housing shortage. we need to be a lot more certain, a lot more accurate, a lot more reasonable about why we're doing this. Why are we protecting these things? And again, I think a lot of the time it's going to come down to, well, it's an old building.
And very finally, is there any way we can know what sort of buildings are going to stand the test of time? Like, we can walk around today and look at like brutalist buildings from the 1960s and think, oh, look at those ugly buildings. What a mistake. And I'm aware a lot of people like brutalist buildings, but I'm pretty sure all of those people are basically our core demographic and nobody else actually does like those sorts of things. So can we be confident what we're building today is going to last, or are we going to look back at the new flats, which we want for political reasons, we want because we want people to have a home today? Are people going to look back in 30, 40, 50 years' time and say, oh, what were they thinking? Those are hideous.
It's possible, isn't it? And if so, that's too bad. They're going to have to go. I think there's got to be a distinction made between what we are talking about in the abundance agenda is the quality of the living environment of the buildings themselves in terms of their space, in terms of their heat, their efficiency, all that sort of stuff. And I would argue there's still a lot more to be said on that too. It's not enough just to put up 1 million flats. They have to be, and they can be, and they are actually pretty good. Whether they will then carry sufficient architectural merit to be listed, some may not. I mean, I think the brutalist thing is for me, oh gosh, I went to see this guy who'd done a final piece for his fine art degree about brutalist buildings a few years ago, and he was talking about a building that wasn't actually brutalist anyway. I don't want to be a pedant about this, but this has become a bit of a bandwagon. But we're going to go back to that. Brutalism actually was a satirical term that was applied to some buildings in a campus up north by someone. But it doesn't matter because brutalism means brutalism now. But it's, for me, okay, look, I think it's great that a lot of mid-20th century buildings are being listed. Some of them are. Plymouth City Council, for example, is quite a notable example. Now, when you look at the language then that was applied for that, yes, we can actually see that we can say why it's of merit. We can place it within an architectural discourse or a school, or we can say, well, this is a building is actually a nod to, Mies van der Rohe or whatever. So yes, we've got all that language done, and I think going forward, actually, I think that is quite healthy in terms of the buildings that we build now, that we protect. So I think there is an interesting thought experiment to be made about the Gherkin, which is a Norman Foster building. Not all his buildings are good. I think the Gherkin is beautiful. Now, would that be worthy of a listing? Well, I think so. At the time, it was talking about having environmental credentials. It wasn't sort of a climate neutral, but there was going to be a green building. Well, that's a bit questionable, but at least it was referencing that language. So it was very early in that. It was definitely a step on from what we call the high tech. So there's the Lloyd's building was the high tech movement of the 80s and 90s. This is into the new generation of these buildings. It's very expressive. It's got huge. Definitely got to list that one. Now, what would happen if, heaven forbid, a bomb went off and the Gherkin got destroyed? Would we rebuild it exactly as it is? I don't think we would. I think we'd say, that was a cracker, but we've got the 3D models, we'll build something better this time. Whereas, if you were to look at an equivalent building from 1750, the majority of voices would want that rebuilt exactly as it was, without any of that, really quite careful sort of deliberation about why it is of merit in the first place. So I think there's a real massive disconnect there. And the question you ask is how we know? Well, we know now because we know how to build things. We've got a really good handle on history. We've got a really good handle on what's going forward. Whereas versus this sort of rather amorphous just view of, oh no, I need that thing back as it was. It's about change and fear of change as well, I think.
Essentially, the corollary of your thought experiment is the Houses of Parliament, Westminster
Absolutely.
Palace, right? A terrible building, probably going to burn down at some point soon. If it does, it wasn't our fault. We didn't predict that. It's just, seems quite likely given the state of it. And again, exactly what you're saying, like a real aversion to moving out of it even temporarily or replacing it with something better, even though it's horrendous to work in by all accounts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you see, the Pugin, the big one is really interesting, isn't it? Because that in itself is a particular type of Gothic building, which really references a load of other typologies as well. It's quite a confection. It's not the real deal. It's a pastiche on something else. So in a sense, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think if that was to burn down, we should just do something new for sure. But that's not going to happen.
Excellent. And listeners, if you've got any designs for a brand new House of Parliament, please do send them in and we'll put them in like a Tony Hart style art gallery set to some music. But for now, I've enjoyed, it's been so fascinating speaking to you and hearing your thoughts. But for now, thank you very much.